It's good to start a new week by realizing that once in a while you can actually turn this thing on and use the camera. Now, what we have for today is a tier list of the DPS in 10.2. No, this is not theory crafting, this is not an opinion, this is not a feeling. What we are doing today is taking the logs from the PTR testing of the heroic bosses which just ended. We have gone through the first boss all the way to the second to last boss because Farak won't be testable, and tested them in heroic. 3 days from now, mythic testing will start. So we're going to be taking the logs of the heroic bosses done in the PTR. You can see here there is like thousands of logs on each and every boss, and then sorted them out by their average DPS, their average performance in each of these bosses. And then we draw some conclusions about the better performing specs so far in the PTR. This is the meaning of the tier list we're going to be doing today. Not anything personal, just by looking at the current results in the PTR. Now, in case you're not aware, this is how the bosses more or less are working in the PTR. We have a majority of pure single target fights. We then have a heavy AoE fight in the first boss, Gnarlroot. We have some significant amount of AoE on Larodar, which wasn't testable anyways, so whatever. And then we have a slight amount of AoE on the second to last boss, Tindral, when all of the raid gets rooted by some vines that you have to blow up, with the final special fight of the Council of Dreams, which will have a very unique type of damage profile. So as we start going through each and every boss, this is the first one. This is Gnarlroot, which is the one with the heavy AoE component. So in the heavy AoE component, we see a group that might be familiar as we keep going through the bosses, because we have Red Paladin, we have Outlaw Rogue, and we have Beast Mastery Hunter towards the better performing specs. We also have Havoc, Demon Hunter. This is, by the way, this was tested on the 14th of September, which means no rework of Havoc had happened yet. So this is old Havoc. Below them you have Fury Warrior, you have Subtlety Rogue, as well as Shadow Priest. Now, towards the bottom we have our usual placeholder of Augmentation, the preservation icon. That's Augmentation. We also have Fire Mage, we have Frost Mage, we have Demolock, Marksmanship Hunter. A lot of specs were doing quite badly on this boss. This one being heavy AoE, though, is not very representative of the rest of the raid. In fact, this first boss is the most AoE you will be doing in the entire raid, right? So it's not that relevant if you're looking at actual performance for, you know, meaningful bosses. The first meaningful boss is the second one, Igira, because it's pure single target. We can go and check a few of the logs, for example, logs of kills, where you get to see the whole thing on the encounter, and we see, what a surprise, a triple Beast Mastery Hunter stack, easily beating everyone else. And you can see by the damage, the majority, besides the spears that you have to get rid of, the majority, 98 or something % of the damage is done to the boss, and in pure single target, Beast Mastery is blasting. Besides Beast Mastery though, talking about single target, we also have Outlaw doing quite well. Here it is, very high average DPS. You also have Red Paladin performing quite well. Frost DK, Unholy DK are both doing well. Shadow Priest, Enhancement, Elemental, Frost Mage, and Feral Druid. The first thing that is noticeable is that Frost Mage is the mage in the PTR. It's the most played mage, and also, spoilers, it's the mage that is doing the best right now. Both Fire and Arcane are doing quite poorly. Now, if we go past Igira and we go to the third boss in order, which is going to be Volcoross, this is another single target fight, and now we go from the single target of Igira, which was full Beast Mastery in the top logs, to Volcoross, which is full Outlaw in the top logs. Maybe, I'm not sure, there might be some problems with the hitbox of the boss itself. It's a pretty unique encounter where the boss is in the middle and you have a giant platform around him and you have to move around quite often, so it's also not that great for hard casting specs that don't want to move very often. So when you look at the rankings, for example, besides the familiar faces at the top, like Outlaw, Beast Mastery, Rat Paladin, Feral Druid, which once more shows up doing very well, and Shadow Priest, many of the others will be melee in this fight. You have Unholy, Assassination, Fury, Enhancement, Arms, Havoc, Windwalker. Basically the majority of the melees are all towards the top half of this encounter. Once more, now it looks like now it starts being somewhat of a trend in terms of performance. The specs towards the bottom include Fire Mage, include Destro, include Devastation, include Augmentation. These specs in the PTR are doing quite poorly. Now, what is surprising is that, for example, for Devastation at the moment, in terms of theory crafting, in terms of preliminary sims and target dummy testing, Devastation seems to be doing very well. It seems to be so powerful you might even start thinking about bringing them in the raid together with Augmentation Evokers. Instead, you know, in terms of actual results in the raid right now, besides the familiar faces at the top doing very well, Devastation is not doing nearly as well. Same can be said for Augmentation, which is performing awfully right now compared to their usual. Maybe there are some problems with logging, Augmentation buffs in the PTR perhaps, or something along these lines, but compared to their current state in 10.1.7, it's a heavy fall compared to that. After these two pure single target fights, we go to the exception of the tier. The exception of the tier, which is Council, the Council of Dreams. As you can see from the top logs, it's a slew of Balanced Druids. And Balanced Druid, in the previous three bosses, Balanced Druid was towards the bottom in pure AoE, Balanced Druid was middle of the pack on single target on Igira, and even lower down on Volcoross with higher movement. Now it shoots up to the absolute SSS tier of this fight. Why? Because the general idea on how you want to play this fight is to have two bosses spread apart, away from each other, and one bigger boss that you ping-pong back and forth between the other two. So basically, for 95% of the spec, this is a two-target cleave fight. You're just hitting the two targets when they are together, and then when the big boss moves to the other boss, you hit them in a constant two-target cleave. However, Balanced Druids get to cheat, because they get to use dots and they get to use Starfall on the third target as well. So they get to do even more damage than the majority of the other specs. Only a few specs can try to keep up, one of them being Shadow Priest, for example, because of also the power of their dots. However, we've also gotten some pretty high results, even just for two-target cleaves in terms of damage, because Outlaw is doing very high damage on two-target cleave, obviously, out of nowhere, but it makes sense. We have Destruction towards one of the better performing specs in two-target cleave. This is not a surprise. Enhancement Shaman is also doing very well in two-target cleave. Beast Mastery Hunter is also still performing very well. We also have a few other familiar faces performing well. Frost Mages, Elemental Shamans, Ret Paladins, and now on multi-target, multi-dotting, we also now have Affliction Warlock. Once more, when it comes to disappointing results, Augmentation, Fire, Arcane, Devastation, Marksmanship Hunter, Frost DK are all still towards the bottom on this special fight as well. We can still give the idea of the power of Balanced Druid on this fight by looking at the damage. As you can see, the average Druid can do almost the same damage to the three different bosses, whereas the melee guy is not, because it doesn't have the same ability to hit them at the same time. So this is a very skewed fight in favor of balance. Once we move to a more even, a more fair boss, which is going to be Smolderon. Now, on Smolderon, once more, you see some familiar faces towards the top. At this point, we have a clear trend, because we see, again, Beast Mastery, Ret, Outlaw doing very well, followed by Shadow Priest, and still specs we have already noticed doing quite well. Fury Warrior, Enhancement Shaman, Feral Druid, Frost Mage are still towards the upper half of the results. And then towards the bottom of the results, once more, it's not too big of a surprise. We see specs like Devastation, specs like Fire Mage, like Augmentation, like Arms, Arcane even, all doing somewhat badly. Now, worth mentioning, Smolderon in terms of testing happened the 15th of September. So this is basically still before the last round of tuning, which happened at this point on the 21st of September. So all of these things changing, which include the major rework of Havoc going live, they include the further nerfs to augmentation, they include a buff to the tier of both Arcane and Fire, they include a reasonable buff to Windwalker, a nerf to Holy Paladin, the nerf to the tier set of Red Paladin. All of these things have not gone live yet in all of this testing. Now though, after we move away from Smolderon and these results and we enter Volcoross, these are the sets after the tuning. So what you will see now in terms of results are after the changes to the PTR to many of the specs. So while once more we see a comically overperforming Outlaw Rogue, because as we mentioned, surprisingly in the changes, when we went over the PTR changes, there were no significant nerfs to Outlaw. We said this one wasn't going to be nearly enough to nerf the spec, and the results are pretty obvious right now. So Outlaw is dominating on Volcoross. Once more, Beast Mastery is still performing quite well. Feral, Shadow, Unholy and Fury Warrior are performing well. What's interesting though is that after the changes we do see Demo Warlock suddenly doing much better. Demo Warlock is amongst the better, 7 or 8 now after the long list of flat out buffs given to the spec. Yes, it still plays like shit, but now the numbers are higher for Demo. Not much has changed for a few of the other specs being buffed, for example, by the changes like Fire or Arcane or Destro or Devastation still being towards the bottom. The other one being tested on the same day was Larodar, which didn't happen because the testing for Larodar was skipped that day. And then we entered the last day of testing with Nymue first. So Nymue is another pure single target fight, as in the boss will have an intermission where you have to go and deal with some adds, but still always on a singular target. The results continue to have a few trends that we have seen before, like Red Paladin, Outlaw and Beast Mastery doing very well. However, we start seeing some changes, because if you look at the highest, amongst the highest of the average DPS, you will start noticing Demo doing again amongst the better results. You also have Destro doing quite well, you also have Elemental, and you also have Feral. And a few of these specs were buffed. You had the very good change to the tier set of Shaman, you had the buffs to Demo, you had the buffs to Destruction, and now the results are being quite more encouraging in terms of pure numbers. Unfortunately, in terms of bad results, we still have Devastation, we still have Augmentation, which also received nerfs. On top of that, we had still Arcane, Fire Mage, Frost Decay still doing quite badly on this fight as well. The last boss of the testing is one of the only few ones without a full single target damage profile, which is Tindral, because it also has a small window of high burst AoE damage when the vines are summoned to root you in place. So you want to stack up together, spawn all the vines and blow them up all at once. So in this fight, we do have, again, broken record, but we do have Ret, Outlaw and BM being the best performing ones. But we have, once more, continued nice performance of Feral Druid, which I am surprised every time I have to say it, but continues to be one of the better performers in the PTR. We have Unholy Decay, also doing very well, Enhancement Shaman towards the top, and a few other familiar faces we have mentioned before towards the top. Fury, Shadow Priest, Elemental Shaman after the change once more towards the top, Destro Warlock after the buffs once more towards the top. Same for the bottom, we have other repeat offenders in this position. We have again Augmentation, we have Devastation, we have Fire Mage, we have Frost Decay, we have the few Marksmanship Hunters who tried to play Marksmanship instead of Beast Mastery and did terribly. Those are the results towards the bottom for Tindral. Now, it was interesting to go through all of the bosses at this moment, because as I mentioned at the start, we are now done with heroic testing. So this was all the testing to be done for heroic fights. In, I think, 4 days, we will get the cycle of mythic testing. It's good to have a nice split in terms of results between the results of Heroic and the results of Mythic, because, for example, the damage profile I mentioned at the start might completely change, might have some differences in Mythic version, in the harder difficulty, because of some maybe extra targets, extra mobs, etc., which might change how things work, and then, more importantly, the tuning that will continue to change. Once we take all of these results together and we make an average of the placements and the average DPS on each boss, this is the result. The result is, unsurprisingly, we have Outlaw, Ret, and Beast Mastery as the best performing specs throughout all of testing. Followed them, we have Shadow Priest, Fury, Unholy, and Feral Druid. These have been the fourth best after the top 3 in terms of results across all bosses. We then have the middle of the pack has a few specs that have been average, so average that we barely even mention them, like Balanced Druid, like Windwalker, like Affliction, or even Enhancement, right? Not really mentioned too often. They have done good damage, decent damage, and in certain niche situations like Balanced Druid, in terms of spread cleave, they were one of the best ones. An asterisk to be put next to Elemental, because their buff to the 4-piece happened halfway through Heroic testing, so maybe they might have shown up to be even stronger if they could test all of the bosses with their buffed 4-piece. And then towards the bottom we have the more disappointing specs. Names you have heard in this video multiple times now: Arcane, Fire, Marksmanship, Devastation, Augmentation, Destro, Frost Decay, Arms Warrior. We haven't even mentioned, by contract, Survival. I was on the edge on whether or not including Survival into the rankings and instead put them at the bottom with the unrated specs: Havoc, Subtlety, and Demo. The reason is because either they are bugged or they had too low amount of logs, not enough players playing them, or they were in the middle of much larger reworks, not just a tiny buff for the Elemental 4-piece, for example, but a full set of major changes like for Demo and like for Havoc, which happened halfway through the testing, for example, so it would have been quite hard to gauge how they are doing given the scope and the size of the changes they have received. But for now, besides those specs at the bottom, these are the current overall raid boss test results in the PTR as we are done with Heroic testing. We will see as we get into Mythic testing what will be the results over time, and of course as we get into the more PTR changes for the specs, for the tier sets, etc., what will change. But for now, I'm going to leave you to the rest of the beginning of your week. We are saying our goodbyes to all of our Patreon supporters, of course, as well as to everyone who is doing it for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself, and that will be a good enough support as well. With these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, you don't know how bad I felt when I was done recording this and then I looked at the recording and the microphone was turned off. Fuck.